The world remembers August 6th and 9th, 1945, the days the sky above Japan burned with fire, when mushroom clouds turned cities into ash, when the atomic bomb ended the war in a single instant. But what if history had taken a different path? What if the United States had never dropped the bombs? Could victory have been achieved by another, bloodier means? Behind the headlines and iconic photographs lies a story of an invasion plan so vast, so terrifying, that it has remained largely unknown outside military archives. It was called Operation Downfall, a plan to storm the Japanese home islands, an assault that promised unimaginable casualties on both sides. Before we dive deeper, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this video because understanding history fully means confronting the questions that often remain buried. Operation Downfall was not a single operation, it was a massive two-phase plan. The first phase, Operation Olympic, targeted the southmost Japanese island of Kyushu. The second phase, Operation Coronet, aimed at the heavily fortified region around Tokyo on Honshu, the heart of the empire. The U.S. military projected that Olympic alone could result in hundreds of thousands of casualties, American and Japanese alike. Entire cities would have become battlegrounds, and the civilian population already scarred by years of firebombing would face an unimaginable siege. The Japanese, of course, were not passive observers. They had fortified their coastlines with the same fanaticism that had defined their defense across the Pacific. Every beach, every ridge, every village became a potential trap. Civilians were conscripted into militias, trained to wield rifles, bamboo spears, and homemade explosives against invading forces. Kamikaze units prepared to crash planes into ships, and thousands of suicide squads rehearsed guerrilla-style ambushes to resist every landing. The Japanese high command believed that inflicting massive casualties on American forces might force the Allies to negotiate rather than conquer. It was a grim calculation, but it was their reality. Intelligence reports from the summer of 1945 painted a harrowing picture. Analysts estimated that between 1 and 4 million Japanese soldiers and civilians would die in the event of a full-scale invasion. American casualties were expected to range from 500,000 to 1 million, including deaths and severe injuries. These projections were not theoretical. They were based on hard data from Okinawa and Iwo Jima, where the U.S. had already faced tenacious Japanese resistance. The memory of those bloody battles fueled urgent debates in Washington, D.C., debates that would eventually lead to the decision to use the atomic bomb. Yet, even before Hiroshima, U.S. planners had been meticulously preparing for the invasion. Maps were drawn, logistical plans formulated, and troops trained for amphibious assaults against fortified positions. Engineers calculated the tons of explosives, the number of landing crafts, and the medical supplies required to sustain an operation that could last months. Soldiers were trained to expect brutal resistance, from entrenched riflemen to civilians prepared to die defending their homeland. The sheer scale of the planning reveals the weight of responsibility carried by military leaders, men who knew that a decision could cost millions of lives. But Operation Downfall was more than just numbers and strategy. It was a study in psychology, morale, and human endurance. Commanders had to anticipate the Japanese will to resist, which had been demonstrated repeatedly throughout the Pacific. Kamikaze attacks, night raids, and guerrilla ambushes were not anomalies, they were standard. Every inch of terrain in Japan would be contested, every city a potential tomb. U.S. leaders understood that even a prolonged invasion could break public morale on both sides, challenging the notion of victory itself. Civilian populations, particularly women and children, would be caught in the crossfire. Japan had mobilized its population in defense of the homeland, creating militias and urging civilians to resist by any means necessary. Entire families were trained in guerrilla tactics, expected to fight to the death. The psychological impact on soldiers tasked with confronting these fighters, often hiding among the innocent, was expected to be severe. Letters from officers in planning stages acknowledged that the war would become not just a military struggle, but a battle of endurance, ethics, and human will. Across the Pacific, American planners debated alternatives to dropping the bomb. Could a conventional invasion succeed? Could a prolonged naval blockade force Japan's surrender without massive loss of life? Estimates suggested a blockade might take years and risk more lives than a single decisive use of atomic weapons. The Japanese home islands were supplied by internal networks that were difficult to fully cut off, and civilian morale was complex. In some cases, the populace was ready to fight to the death rather than surrender. These factors compounded the uncertainty. Any alternative strategy carried staggering risk. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the atomic bomb program had advanced rapidly. Manhattan Project scientists understood that their creation was both a weapon and a symbol, a demonstration of power that could bring the war to a sudden and irreversible end. Military and political leaders weighed the human cost of an invasion against the ethical and moral implications of using a weapon of mass destruction. Was it justified to kill hundreds of thousands instantly to prevent the slow, grinding death of millions over months? The moral calculus was as complex as any battlefield strategy. Even among U.S. generals, opinions diverged. Some argued that Japan was already on the brink of surrender, weakened by months of firebombing and naval blockades. Others contended that surrender without an invasion was unlikely, given Japan's demonstrated will to resist to the last man, as seen at Okinawa. Intelligence intercepted from Japanese communications showed an unwavering commitment to fight, and this convinced many leaders that a conventional invasion might not bring an unconditional surrender. As the days passed leading to Hiroshima, the tension was palpable. Soldiers prepared, maps were finalized, and logistics tightened. Operation Olympic would involve more than 1 million American troops landing on Kyushu's beaches, supported by thousands of aircrafts and ships. The plan assumed fierce resistance, with infantry expected to take heavy casualties from entrenched riflemen, artillery, mines, and suicidal attacks. Each objective was layered with contingency plans, from medical evacuation protocols to replacements for lost commanders. The sheer scale was almost unimaginable, a testament to the human capacity for both planning and destruction. Historians have since debated endlessly. Could Japan have been defeated without atomic weapons? Some argue that the U.S. conventional forces, combined with the ongoing blockade and relentless air raids, would eventually compel surrender, but at a horrific cost. Casualties could easily have reached millions, with entire cities reduced to rubble, not by a single bomb, but by months of conventional warfare. The human suffering on both sides would have been immense, the psychological scars profound, and the moral questions just as pressing. Yet the atomic bomb remains controversial precisely because it forced a decision. The invasion plan, the one they never used, shows the scale of potential suffering that was avoided. Soldiers trained for weeks, officers calculated logistics with precision, and civilians prepared for the worst. The bomb, in a tragic and ironic twist, became a tool to prevent what may have been even greater bloodshed. Understanding Operation Downfall also helps contextualize Japan's final days. The military leadership knew about the invasion plans and prepared accordingly, fortifying beaches, conscripting civilians, and readying kamikaze pilots. The empire's desperation was not just a reaction to bombs, but a strategic calculation in anticipation of an assault that could have eclipsed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in sheer carnage. The home islands were a fortress prepared to bleed the Allies dry, and only the atomic bomb circumvented what could have been the deadliest confrontation in human history. As we trace the contours of this plan, it becomes clear that history is never simple. Decisions are made in uncertainty, with incomplete information and moral ambiguity. Leaders weighed lives, strategy, and honor in ways that would define the future. The question of whether the U.S. could have won without the bombs is intertwined with ethics, chance, and sheer human endurance. In the next part, we will explore the second phase of Operation Downfall, Operation Coronet, the invasion of Honshin, and the detailed planning of what could have been the most catastrophic military operation in history. We will examine casualty projections, Japanese defensive strategies, and the psychological toll anticipated on both soldiers and civilians, painting a full picture of a war that might have consumed millions more lives had the bombs not been used. Operation Coronet, the second and deadliest phase of Operation Downfall, targeted Honshu, the Japanese home island and the heart of the empire. The stakes were unlike anything ever planned in military history. While Operation Olympic had aimed for the southernmost island of Kyushu, Coronet would strike at the Kanto Plain near Tokyo, where the political, economic, and military centers of Japan were concentrated. This was not just an invasion, it was an attempt to break the spine of a nation prepared to fight to the last man, woman, and child. American planners meticulously studied previous Pacific campaigns to anticipate the resistance they would face. Battles like Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Saipan had demonstrated the tenacity and ingenuity of Japanese defense. Soldiers trained for conventional warfare had been forced into grueling combat against entrenched defenders who used tunnels, caves, and urban fortifications to lethal effect. Commanders predicted that the invasion of Honshu could take months and possibly years, with casualties surpassing anything seen in the war so far. Every inch of territory would be contested. Every city could become a tomb. Logistics for such an operation were mind-boggling. More than 2 million soldiers supported by thousands of ships, hundreds of aircraft, and immense amounts of supplies would descend on Honshu. Every aspect was planned to the smallest detail: evacuation routes for the wounded, supply chains for food and ammunition, medical facilities for hundreds of thousands of injured troops, and protocols for replacing fallen officers. Even the weather was studied obsessively. Storm patterns, tides, and visibility could make the difference between success and total disaster. Commanders understood that any miscalculation could cost tens of thousands of lives immediately. The Japanese had prepared to defend every inch of their homeland with fanaticism. Civilians were armed, trained, and indoctrinated for resistance. Teenage boys, elderly men, and women were drafted into militias, taught to use rifles, grenades, and even improvised weapons. Cities were turned into fortresses. Tunnels, bunkers, and hidden artillery positions dotted the landscape. Every street, every building, every alley could conceal a sniper or a trap. Propaganda emphasized honor, glory, and the sacred duty of dying for the emperor. For U.S. planners, the message was clear: they would not just fight soldiers, they would confront an entire population determined to resist at all costs. Casualty projections were staggering. Estimates suggested that over 1 million American soldiers could be killed or severely wounded during the operation, while several million Japanese civilians and soldiers could die in the crossfire. These numbers accounted not only for direct combat, but also for starvation, disease, and the collapse of infrastructure during prolonged urban warfare. No plan could eliminate the human suffering that such an invasion would produce. Commanders repeatedly asked themselves whether victory could justify the loss of life on such a scale. The Japanese defenses were formidable. Mines littered the beaches, artillery positions dominated the coast, and kamikaze units prepared to crash into American ships, sinking transport vessels and disrupting supply lines. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese forces were willing to fight to the death to protect the homeland, anticipating that massive casualties inflicted on the Americans might force them to reconsider their invasion. In short, Japan intended to make Honshu a tomb for any invading army. The moral debate in Washington was intense. Some military leaders argued that continuing conventional warfare would result in a slow, drawn-out conflict with unimaginable casualties on both sides. Others believed that a naval blockade combined with strategic bombing could force Japan to surrender without an invasion. Yet evidence from battles across the Pacific suggested otherwise. Japan's resolve had not weakened, even under the crushing force of firebombing campaigns and naval blockades. The Japanese government, military, and population had demonstrated repeatedly that surrender was not an option they would easily accept. Urban warfare scenarios were especially worrying. Cities would be transformed into battlegrounds, with every building a potential stronghold and every street an ambush zone. Infantry would have to fight room by room, often against civilians trained to resist. Even the most meticulously planned assaults could not prevent catastrophic losses. Soldiers would face moral dilemmas, engaging combatants who were also innocent civilians. confronting children, elderly men, and women wielding weapons in desperation. The psychological toll of such fighting would be immense. Meanwhile, the Japanese civilian population had been fully mobilized. Schools, temples, and homes became training centers for combat and survival. Children were taught guerrilla tactics, civilians practiced sabotage and first aid, and women produced weapons and supported logistical efforts. The entire society was militarized, ready to participate in the defense of the homeland. The U.S. military recognized that this made the invasion even more lethal and predictable. Civilian resistance, coupled with trained soldiers and kamikaze attacks, meant that every advance could be contested violently and unpredictably. Historians today describe Operation Coronet as potentially the bloodiest military operation in human history. Every decision, every calculated movement represented a wager on millions of lives. Public pressure in the United States added to the urgency. The American public, exhausted from years of war, demanded a decisive end. Leaders faced a cruel calculation: prolong the war with a conventional invasion and risk a staggering loss of life, or deploy a weapon that could end the conflict instantly, but bring moral consequences of its own. This moral calculus is central to understanding why the atomic bomb was ultimately used. President Truman, the military high command, and scientists involved in the Manhattan Project understood that an invasion of Honshu would result in hundreds of thousands, perhaps over 1 million American casualties and millions more Japanese deaths. The atomic bomb, despite its horrific destructive power, offered a grimly efficient alternative. It was not just an offensive weapon, it was a means to prevent even greater bloodshed. Even decades later, historians continue to debate whether Japan could have been defeated without the atomic bomb. Some argue that Japan was already nearing collapse due to firebombing, blockade, and military setbacks. Others contend that Japan's culture of resistance and willingness to fight to the last man meant that a conventional invasion could have prolonged the war for months, possibly years, at catastrophic human costs. Military records, letters, and intelligence reports from 1945 confirmed that the U.S. High Command genuinely believed a full-scale invasion would be apocalyptic. Ultimately, Operation Coronet highlights an alternative history that never occurred, a world in which the war continued with unimaginable suffering, cities destroyed, and millions dead. It reveals why the atomic bomb, despite its horror, was chosen. It was a decision to prevent a greater tragedy. The shadow of Operation Downfall reminds us of the human cost of war and the difficult decisions that shaped the end of World War II. The strategic complexity of the invasion cannot be overstated. Coordinating land, sea, and air forces on such a scale, anticipating Japanese tactics, and preparing for worst-case scenarios required an unprecedented level of planning. Amphibious landings had to be synchronized with air raids, artillery barrages, and supply lines. Casualty evacuation plans were drafted for hundreds of thousands of wounded soldiers, knowing that medical facilities would be overwhelmed. Commanders planned for contingencies, from collapsed bridges to unexpected civilian uprisings, understanding that failure at any point could result in disaster. The Japanese, for their part, did not rely solely on conventional defenses. They had perfected guerrilla warfare tactics, fortified villages, and trained civilians in hand-to-hand combat, booby traps, and sabotage. Resistance would not be limited to organized military units. Entire neighborhoods could become death traps. Every advance by U.S. forces would likely be contested at extreme costs, and every victory could bring massive casualties. The invasion promised to be a grinding, multi-front nightmare with psychological, moral, and logistical challenges that were almost impossible to manage. As this planning unfolded, the atomic bomb program accelerated. The Manhattan Project offered a means to bypass what could have been the most devastating invasion in history. Leaders were faced with a harrowing choice: use the bomb and end the war instantly, or risk a prolonged invasion that would cost millions of lives. The decision was fraught with moral, political, and strategic complexity. Every officer, every scientist, every politician involved understood the weight of their actions. In conclusion, Operation Coronet was more than an invasion. It was a blueprint for potential catastrophe. Millions could have died, cities obliterated, and the very fabric of Japanese society shattered. Understanding the scale of what never happened highlights why the atomic bomb, despite its horror, was chosen. It was a decision to prevent a greater tragedy. The shadow of Operation Downfall reminds us of the human cost of war and the difficult decisions that shaped the end of World War II. In the next part, we will explore the human cost in deeper detail, examining the experiences soldiers would have faced, the impact on Japanese civilians, and the stories of survival, fear, and courage that were never written because the invasion never occurred. We will also analyze the ethical dilemmas faced by both sides and the enduring lessons that history offers. The human cost of Operation Cornet was not just numbers on a page. It was unimaginable suffering, terror, and moral complexity. Planners had calculated casualties, yet they could not fully account for the psychological toll, the chaos of urban warfare, or the desperation of soldiers facing civilians turned combatants. As troops approached the beaches of Honshu, they would have confronted a world transformed into a living nightmare, where every home, alley, and building could conceal a death trap. The meticulous maps and simulations could not capture the terror in the eyes of a child, the grief of a mother, or the breakdown of morality when survival became the only law. American soldiers, conditioned for traditional combat, would face a new reality, fighting a population that was armed, trained, and ideologically committed to die for their homeland. Teenagers wielding rifles, elderly men with improvised weapons, and women prepared to resist occupation would make every step forward a perilous gamble. Entire towns had been fortified with tunnels, booby traps, and barricades. Every street corner, every doorway could conceal an enemy willing to sacrifice themselves to halt the advance. Casualty rates would soar not only from bullets and explosives, but from disease, starvation, and exposure as the infrastructure of the island collapsed under relentless attack. For civilians, the invasion would have been catastrophic. Japan's government had already prepared its population for the possibility of total war. Schools, temples, and homes were converted into defensive positions, while rationing and conscription had depleted resources for ordinary survival. Those who survived bombings and naval bombardments would face a different horror. Their cities invaded by foreign troops, homes reduced to rubble, and families separated or killed in the crossfire. The psychological impact alone would have left a generation scarred, haunted by trauma that would persist long after the war ended. Commanders on both sides faced impossible decisions. The Americans needed to neutralize resistance quickly while minimizing their own losses, yet they had no way of ensuring either. Tactics that worked on Iwo Jima and Okinawa might not scale to a full invasion of Honshu, where millions of civilians could intervene in combat operations. Every order carried moral weight. Instruct a soldier to fire upon a fortified house and risk killing civilians, or hold fire and risk their squad being wiped out by enemy combatants hidden inside. The war was not only a physical battle, but a test of conscience, judgment, and leadership under impossible circumstances. Japanese commanders, for their part, prepared for total annihilation. Kamikaze units were readied for mass attacks, willing to die alongside their aircraft to inflict maximum damage. Artillery, mines, and naval forces were positioned to delay or destroy advancing troops at every opportunity. Civilians were mobilized to harass, resist, and impede the invaders. The ethos of Bushido, honor, loyalty, and the acceptance of death over surrender was drilled into soldiers and citizens alike. Every defense plan aimed not to hold ground indefinitely, but to inflict maximum casualties and make the cost of occupation unbearable. Urban warfare scenarios presented unique challenges. Streets would be littered with rubble and debris, each building a potential fortress. Infantry would have to clear block by block, risking ambushes and sniper fire at every turn. Civilians, trained and indoctrinated, could act as human shields or armed resistors.
Tanks and artillery would be limited in effectiveness in tightly packed cities, forcing soldiers into close-quarter combat where casualties would multiply rapidly. Medical services would be overwhelmed, and evacuation of the wounded would be nearly impossible under constant fire. Logistical nightmares would compound the physical challenges. Supplying 2 million soldiers on hostile territory, maintaining communication lines, and transporting the wounded would push U.S. military capabilities to the limit. Ports and airfields would be primary targets for Japanese defense, making the delivery of reinforcements and supplies extremely dangerous. Every landing craft, every cargo ship, every convoy could become a target for kamikaze attacks or artillery fire. Commanders calculated losses in ships, planes, and men, but uncertainty remained. The chaos of battle often defies the best-laid plans. Civilian resistance added another layer of unpredictability. Unlike previous campaigns where the local population was largely non-combatant, Japanese society had been fully militarized. Entire families were trained to fight, and children as young as 10 were taught to use firearms and explosives. Women were prepared to defend their homes, while elderly men took to the mountains to harass supply lines and staging areas. This level of societal involvement transformed the invasion from a conventional military operation into a total war scenario, where every living being could participate in combat. Ethical dilemmas loomed over every decision. Soldiers would face civilians, armed or acting as combatants. How could they distinguish between innocent non-combatants and willing participants in the defense? Every choice carried potential for tragedy. Even retreat was not an option. Falling back under fire could result in annihilation. Commanders had to balance objectives with human costs, knowing that any miscalculation could result in mass death. History would judge these choices, but in the heat of the battle, judgment would often come too late. In the planning rooms of Washington and Hawaii, debates raged over alternatives. Some proposed intensifying conventional bombing campaigns. Others suggested tightening blockades. But intelligence indicated that Japan's military-industrial complex, while weakened, could still sustain resistance for months, possibly years. Leaders understood that prolonging the conflict would result in far higher casualties than even the bloodiest projections of Operation Downfall. The atomic bomb, therefore, emerged as a strategic solution, a way to avoid a nightmare invasion without guaranteeing moral absolution. The human stories that could have emerged from Coronet are almost impossible to imagine. Families torn apart, soldiers facing impossible choices, civilians caught in the crossfire. These narratives remained unwritten because the invasion never occurred. Yet historians reconstruct these possibilities using maps, casualty projections, and personal accounts from previous Pacific campaigns. They paint a vivid, horrifying picture. Cities engulfed in smoke, streets filled with rubble and bodies, desperate civilians hiding while fighting alongside trained soldiers, and the psychological toll on every survivor. By examining Operation Coronet, one can understand the magnitude of the decision to use the atomic bomb. It was not simply a military tactic, but a choice between two forms of massive human suffering. An invasion would have created a landscape of death, destruction, and trauma unparalleled in history. The bomb, while catastrophic in its immediate effects, prevented what could have been an even greater calamity. A prolonged ground war with casualties numbering in the millions. In the end, Operation Coronet stands as a testament to the horrors of war that were narrowly avoided. It reveals a world in which conventional strategies, no matter how meticulous, could not ensure safety, survival, or moral clarity. Soldiers would have faced unimaginable challenges, civilians would have been caught in the crossfire, and the ethical calculus of victory would have been impossible to reconcile. In the final part, we will examine the aftermath, the human legacy, and the moral lessons that emerge when we consider the invasion that never happened. We will explore how the knowledge of what could have been shapes our understanding of war, the consequences of strategic decisions, and the enduring question, Could the U.S. have won World War II without the atomic bombs?
As the world contemplates the conclusion of World War II, it is easy to forget what almost happened: the invasion of Honshu and the potential devastation that could have rivaled the worst nightmares of humanity. Operation Coronet, meticulously planned but never executed, stands as a haunting reminder of how close history came to a prolonged and unimaginably bloody conclusion. The stakes were clear. Failure or delay would mean millions of additional deaths, cities destroyed beyond recognition, and the psychological scars of combat etched deeply into every survivor. Soldiers assigned to Coronet would have faced conditions that defy imagination. They would have landed on beaches laced with mines, under relentless artillery fire, and in the line of sight of defenders trained to resist at all costs. Every step inland could have meant encountering civilians armed and prepared to fight. The integration of civilian and military resistance made traditional combat models nearly useless. Soldiers would have needed to clear every house, building, and street, room by room, floor by floor, knowing that ambushes could come from anywhere. The psychological strain alone would have been a weapon against the invading forces. For the Japanese population, the invasion promised a cataclysm. Entire cities would be transformed into fortresses, and every citizen, men, women, and even children, was expected to resist. The Japanese government had trained, armed, and indoctrinated its people for exactly this scenario. Civilians were ready to fight, to die, and to disrupt the invaders' advance at every opportunity. The moral complexity of such total resistance would have been staggering for American soldiers. Combatants and civilians indistinguishable, humanity caught in the crossfire, and ethical decisions made in the midst of chaos with irreversible consequences. The casualty estimates for Operation Coronet are almost unfathomable. U.S. military planners projected more than 1 million American casualties, with hundreds of thousands killed outright. Japanese military losses could have numbered several million, with civilian deaths reaching even higher levels due to combat, starvation, disease, and urban destruction. Medical facilities would have been overwhelmed from day one, and evacuation of the wounded could have become impossible under constant enemy fire. The sheer scale of death and suffering was unprecedented, making Coronet potentially the deadliest campaign in human history. Strategically, the invasion was complicated beyond measure. Logistics required the coordination of hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of ships, aircraft, and supply lines stretching across hundreds of miles. Ports had to be captured, airfields secured, and supply chains protected from attack by kamikaze pilots and artillery fire. Intelligence had to anticipate every defensive move by Japanese forces, but even the best reconnaissance could not guarantee success. The potential for catastrophe lurked in every decision. A single miscalculated assault could lead to thousands of deaths. A failed supply line could stall the invasion entirely, and any breakdown in coordination could be fatal. The psychological strain alone would have been a weapon against the invading forces. Ethically, the plan presented dilemmas that have haunted historians and military analysts for decades. Soldiers would have been forced to engage civilians in combat situations where distinguishing between combatant and non-combatant was nearly impossible. Parents, children, and elderly civilians trained and indoctrinated for resistance could have become unwilling participants in their own destruction. Every order to advance would have carried moral weight, and the consequences of hesitation or error could have been catastrophic. The invasion promised not only physical carnage, but deep ethical and psychological wounds. The Japanese defense was fanatical, reflecting decades of cultural, social, and military preparation. Bushido principles, honor, loyalty, and a willingness to die for one's country were deeply ingrained in every soldier and many civilians. Kamikaze attacks were only one aspect of this defense. Ordinary citizens were prepared to fight to their last breath. Urban combat was expected to be particularly brutal, with defenders using tunnels, booby traps, and improvised explosives to inflict maximum casualties. The psychological impact of facing an entire society determined to resist was understood by U.S. planners, and it influenced every aspect of operational planning. By the time the atomic bomb was ready to be used, Operation Coronet remained the most dangerous scenario imaginable. The bomb offered an alternative, a rapid, decisive end to the war, preventing the catastrophic human toll of a full-scale invasion. While morally and ethically fraught, it was a tool designed to save lives on a scale impossible to achieve with conventional warfare.
Leaders understood that without it, the war could continue for months or years, with escalating destruction and death on both sides. Reflecting on Coronet also reveals the human stories that were never lived. Soldiers who would have faced harrowing conditions, civilians caught between combatants, families torn apart, and entire cities devastated. These are tragedies that history only speculates upon. Diaries, letters, and intelligence reports allow historians to imagine the suffering, but the reality of millions of lives potentially lost remains beyond full comprehension. The invasion would have tested humanity itself, pushing courage, morality, and endurance to their absolute limits. As planners simulated each phase of the invasion, they imagined the worst-case scenarios in meticulous detail. Casualty estimates, logistical bottlenecks, and urban resistance patterns were mapped extensively. Soldiers were trained for months on tactics learned from previous Pacific campaigns, but even experience could not prepare them for the scale and intensity of fighting anticipated on Honshu. Every day of combat promised unimaginable suffering, but every hour delayed the conclusion of the war increased the human cost elsewhere, both in the Pacific and across the globe. Operation Coronet also illustrates the role of chance and timing in history. The atomic bomb, while devastating, prevented a campaign that could have created a multi-year nightmare of loss, disease, and societal collapse. Without it, Japan's surrender might have been delayed indefinitely, and the full scale of human suffering could have been beyond measure. The invasion never occurred, but the meticulous preparation and projections provide a chilling window into what might have been. A war without end, a human cost unmatched in modern history. Finally, the invasion underscores the weight of leadership decisions in wartime. Political and military leaders had to make choices that would determine the fate of millions, balancing morality, strategy, and human life. The atomic bomb, controversial as it remains, ended a scenario that could have been far more catastrophic. Leaders faced a paradox, the choice between an immediate, horrifying act of destruction and a prolonged, grinding slaughter on an unprecedented scale. Operation Coronet's unrealized reality reminds us of the difficult, sometimes impossible decisions required in global conflict. History, in this case, is as much about what did not happen as what did. The atomic bomb prevented the invasion, yet understanding the scale and planning of Operation Coronet allows us to grasp the sheer magnitude of the war that could have been. Soldiers, civilians, and entire societies were spared from months or years of combat. It's a sobering reminder of the fragility of human life, the stakes of leadership, and the extreme consequences that can arise from a single decision in wartime. As we close the narrative of Operation Downfall and the invasion that never occurred, it is essential to reflect on the lessons it offers. Warfare is not abstract. It is human, brutal, and costly. Decisions made by leaders affect millions of lives, and sometimes the lines between moral responsibility and strategic necessity blur almost beyond recognition. The atomic bomb, tragic as its use was, spared the unimaginable carnage of Operation Coronet, preserving millions of lives while leaving a legacy of ethical debate that continues to this day.